and still take some questions. So now on my screen, I've lost the PowerPoint. Can you?
Sorry.
Can you still see the PowerPoint from the participant side?
There you are again.
There we go. Good. Okay. So, well, why don't we begin? So resiliency is a very interesting subject, one that's very pertinent to me. But what I've learned is if you ask 10 people what resiliency means, you're going to get 12 different answers. And depending on where the person's coming from, if they're in the behavioral health field, if they're a teacher, if they're a coach or an athlete, or if they're in a construction business, they're going to give you different answers on what resiliency is. And so we're going to talk in this lecture about personal resiliency and how that resiliency can help us or help individuals meet the challenges as they go through life. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to elicit or solicit any comments on this, but as we begin, I want you to think on what's the worst thing that has happened to you in your life. And the reason for this is as we go forward, we're going to talk about how we can help people learn resiliency, but we need to understand some things about ourselves at first. Now you can read the slide there, but I want you to look at a few possibilities. For some individuals, the worst thing that's happened to them is a single event. For others, whoop, can you go back one slide there? And for others, it was more of multiple events that happened over time. And for others, it was kind of this chronic wearing down. So as you think, and as we go through this, keep in mind the worst thing that's happened to you. Think about those things on, was it single, multiple, or a chronic wearing down type of thing? Next slide. So on this one, we can see that trauma is actually very unique to each individual. Two people can experience the same trauma, but the way they internalize it and how it impacts them is very different. Again, referring to you and what's happened to you or me, each of us individually, look at these different things here and take a moment and reflect a little bit on how did that impact your mood or physical health, any sense of hope or sense of the future? How did it impact relationships? How did it impact perhaps your job? And were you still able to do that job, or did you struggle a little bit on that job? So although trauma is experienced individually, there are some common patterns we need to be aware of. Next slide, please. All right, so, oh, there we go, that's the one. So on this, again, here's some common patterns. We've talked, you've no doubt have been trained and have learned the issues of fight, flight, or freeze, how different parts of the brain reacts. There's also withdraw, engage, anger, and despair. I want to share with you something that it's not totally from the field of trauma or the field of resiliency. This comes from GriefWorks. A lot of times our traumatic events result in a loss. And as we all learned, as we were trained in therapy and such, every loss needs to be grieved appropriately in order to move forward. And so a lot of times in our own lives, or those that we're trying to help, as they've experienced trauma, they need some help in that grieving. Now, all of us also learned about Kubler-Ross and her 5 stages of grief. And I'd actually like to challenge that a little bit. If you remember, her stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I think those are 5 stages of hearing bad news or something that's been very shocking. They aren't necessarily the stages of grief. And over the years, I've become acquainted with something called GriefWorks, and they use the tier model of grief. And you can see it over here, the tasks of grief: to accept the loss. You could look at Kubler-Ross and her 5 stages would all fit in that T. To experience the pain. A lot of times people try and move forward without having fully experienced the emotion of it. To adjust to the new environment. Now, GriefWorks deals with loss of a loved one, but it could be loss of a job or loss of other things. And then R is to reinvest in the new reality. Now, the reason I bring this up in a lecture on resiliency is that this tier model actually is a pretty good model on how does someone deal with trauma and begin to move forward. So looking back on your own trauma and something that worst thing that's happened to you, how did you change with the result of that? And it really comes down to two big questions. Did you crumble or did you bounce? Were you able to bounce on that? Next slide. So there's also a little bit of a timeline. We have the event, we have the injury. Almost everyone who goes through a traumatic event ends up taking some time in isolation. They withdraw, whether it's an athlete who got injured on the sports field, and then they have some time to recover. And at some point, in order to re-engage in good, healthy life, again, we need to re-engage. Sometimes there's a little bit of a relapse. That might not be the right word with resiliency and trauma and recovery, but there's a period of struggling, perhaps going back in isolation again, recovery, and then re-engaging. And for all of us thinking on what difficult, traumatic thing may have happened to us, you could probably track out that you've gone through a very similar process in your own life. Next slide. So this brings us to a really important question on what determines, so we're thinking about our most difficult time or traumatic event, what determines if someone experiences post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic growth? Or is there a mixture of both? And here's where I'd like to have a little bit of participation. Anyone have an idea, want to contribute a thought here on what's the big discriminator or the enabler that someone either goes down the path of post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic growth? I can't see you and enable you to talk, so just unmute and shout out what you're thinking.
Raise your hand and I'll unmute you if it doesn't.
I was going to say protective factors.
All right, what do you mean by protective factors?
Like a nurturing environment and relationships, community resources, like a system of care around you.
Yeah, that's really good, isn't it? And studies have shown that people who have those uniformly do better. Any other thoughts?
Unhealthy coping mechanisms.
So the kind of the reverse of that. So instead of a protective factor, maybe a vulnerability that comes from unhealthy coping mechanisms. Very good. Those of you that have been trained in CBT, you know some of those thought errors, the catastrophification, the black and white thinking, things of that. So sometimes when people are struggling, they go to their basic level of response and pull out unhealthy coping mechanisms. Very good. Other thoughts?
At least one healthy and positive relationship.
At least one, right? We don't need an enormous number of them, but at least one. Now, I'm retired military and we've lived all over the world as a family. None of my kids started and finished the same high school, and two of them went to 3 different high schools over their years. And so when we found over time that when they started school, if they could get one good friend, that was going to be a successful year or a successful school situation. Sometimes it took a while to find that one good friend. Sometimes it happened quicker. And sometimes they tried to jump into a friendship a little bit too soon, not really knowing what was going on, and that didn't necessarily turn out to be the one good friend that they needed. So absolutely, the relationship is very good. Any other thoughts?
I would say hope, the idea that they could do it, could get over it.
Yeah, right. Where does that hope come from, do you think?
So it's a mindset that we've either learned or, you know, grown up around people that have taught us to be hopeful.
Exactly. And I like the term that you just used, mindset. My wife came from a very optimistic family. I'm a New Yorker, so genetically I'm pessimistic. And so sometimes we will get into a situation and she'll view the situation very differently from me. And she has that optimistic mindset. Any last thoughts? And then we'll go on. One more comment. I see a comment here, our prior experiences and environment, absolutely. So previous experiences are part of that. Good. So next slide. So given all of this, let's throw out some ideas. Here's another good participation slide on what are different definitions of resiliency that you have heard. Any thoughts on the definition of resiliency? Michael, I don't know if you need to click on anyone, unmute them.
I was just gonna say it's kind of a learned process. It's not necessarily built in, that we grow from trauma or stress or experiences.
I like that. And we're going to talk about how resiliency is learned. And we just had a comment come up, the ability to bounce. And you hear in different literature and people talking about resiliency, this term bounce comes up again and again. So the ability to bounce back. Any other, we'll take one more comment on this and then we'll go on. Any other thoughts on a definition of resiliency? All right, well, let's go to the next slide, and thank you for those comments. Here's some definitions that some people have used. Right there on top, the ability to bounce back and carry on, the ability to weather adversity, the ability to grow from adverse events and find meaning in them. Notice that all three of these have the word ability. Now, some definitions of resiliency won't use the term ability, but I think that it's that ability is an important one, and we can, from our discussion already, see how this all helps. This quote below by Elizabeth Lucas is interesting. Now, Elizabeth Lucas, she was a colleague of Viktor Frankl, and many of you might recognize that name. He's the person who wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning, one of the best books on existentialism and dealing with adversity. And as you might recall, he was a Jewish psychiatrist practicing in Vienna during World War II. He and his family went to Auschwitz. He was the only survivor. And during his time at Auschwitz, the concentration camp, he observed people and tried to answer the question in his mind, why do some people survive and some people don't? And so that's the basis of his book, Man's Search for Meaning. Certainly a environment of adversity, an environment of stress and trauma. And so his whole book in future logotherapy, his philosophical process is embodied in that. But this quote by Elizabeth Lucas is very good. I like it. Now this book here, this picture can't hurt me. This is a book by a man named David Goggins. This is really an interesting book and a book on tape or audio book. David was he wanted to join the Navy and become a Navy SEAL. He went to the recruiting office and he was 100 pounds overweight. And so the recruiter told him the admission date or deadline, whatever it is in 3 months. And if you can lose the weight, we'll put you up to the board and you can go to a selection to see if you'll be selected or not. And so that started his journey. To make a long story short, he lost 100 pounds in 90 days. He qualified for Navy SEAL training, became a Navy SEAL, had a successful career in that. And then afterwards, towards the end of his career, and then after, he became an ultra athlete, running these 100-mile races and cycling events and things of that sort. The book is very fascinating. He came from a difficult family upbringing and circumstance. And so the whole book is just laced with issues and topics related to resiliency. I have to say some of his choices may not have been the healthiest choices, but through his determination, he made it through on that. But the book is a good one on overcoming, enduring, setting goals, and not giving up. And all of these things are attributes or characteristics of resiliency as well. Just a little bit of a warning. If you listen to the audiobook or read the book, I think David drops the F-bomb about every fourth word for 300 pages. So be ready for a little bit of spicy sailor talk as you go through the book on that. All right, next slide, please. So what role do the following things have on our ability to bounce? We'll kind of use that bounce term. And for those of you, trained in therapy and such, this, as you look at these, this harkens back to the biopsychosocial factors that we're trained in. But look at these here. I'll let you read through those. But I want to direct your thought to the very first one, choice. So a question, is resiliency a choice? Any thoughts or comments on that?
I think yeah, choice could be part of it. I think it's also goes along with your brain thoughts and how positive or negative you are, as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, I would say yeah, choice.
Yeah, so, and we have here a comment typed in to a degree, yes. Yeah, choice plays a role. Now, it's not the whole thing. We can't say I choose to be resilient, therefore I am resilient, but it's in the choices we make will help us put us in the right path towards resiliency, both in the development of resiliency characteristics in ourselves and choice of how we're going to deal with a traumatic situation in front of us. These other factors also play a role. Genetics definitely plays a role. And there's certain research done on genetics. For example, the Jewish families of the Holocaust, there's a lot of research done on the transgenerational transmission of trauma. So the traumatic experience of those survivors of the Holocaust who went on to have children, how did their experience in the Holocaust influence how they parented, how they raised their children, and was there in fact a genetic, epigenetics transition of some of these things? So you have a comment here, it seems to be a matter of being empowered. I agree. So we have choice, we have genetics, physical health, mental health, now neuroplasticity. What do you think about neuroplasticity? If neuroplasticity helps, that's our ability of our brain to adapt and grow in certain circumstances. We know our neuroplasticity decreases over time. So I'm almost 60. My neuroplasticity is probably less than when I was 40. So does that make me more resilient or less resilient? Any thoughts on that?
I think, unfortunately, as we get older, we probably become less resilient.
Yeah, you'd think that, but studies aren't always supportive of that, which is really interesting. So here's a comment. I think it depends on the pathway you create. Yeah, I agree, right. So there's a lot of other factors in this. In fact, some of you may have heard of the program. It was one of the original outdoor wilderness programs called Outward Bound. Outward Bound was developed in England by actually a German gentleman who emigrated to England, I think prior to World War II, Kurt Hahn. And he noticed that when World War II happened, when the British merchant marines went out to sea, so these are the commercial, not military, but commercial ships that carried fuel, oil, food, material, things like that. When these ships went out, of course, this was the time, as you might recall in World War II history, of the German wolf packs and these submarines that would hunt down ships and sink them at sea. If people were rescued from that and they were brought back, Kurt noticed that there was an inversion, that you would think that the young sailors, the 20-somethings, would bounce back better, but in fact, the older sailors, the 40 and 50-somethings, bounce back better. Some of the young sailors, if their ship had been torpedoed and sunk and they were rescued at sea, some of these young sailors would refuse to go back out to sea, and they really struggled. Whereas the old sailors, give them a 3-day pass and enough money to get drunk once or twice, and they'd show up to work again on the following Monday or a week later, whatever it is. And so what he determined and learned was these older sailors actually had more resiliency because of their previous experience. They'd been on ships that maybe had sunk in gales and hurricanes, or had maybe the boiler blew up on the ship and there were injuries or things like that. And because of past experience, there was an accumulation of these experiences that helped them. So this neuroplasticity is definitely a factor, but it is one factor, not the only factor. In life experience, studies have shown if one chooses the right path, or if one has a history of overcoming, these past life experience actually are quite formative in helping that person be resilient. All right, so this raises the question of what's self-efficacy? Has anyone ever heard that term, and what does that mean to you, self-efficacy? All right, feeling confident in what we're able to accomplish. Excellent, I think you guys are right on. Next slide, please. So here's a definition of self-efficacy: a person's belief that they can be successful. And perceived self-efficacy refers to people's belief about their capability to exercise control over their own activities. So I have a picture here of 3 people who just summited a mountain somewhere. So I would say, and I would imagine all or most of you would agree, that these people have self-efficacy. I doubt that this is the first mountain that they climbed, and maybe it's been years of training of climbing smaller mountains and medium mountains and then bigger mountains and then finally this big mountain, that they are undertaking the task or the adventure, whatever term you want to use, to climb this mountain because they have self-efficacy. These 3 people, not necessarily, but in our little imagined story here, maybe they knew each other and have trained together and climbed together. And so they have this perceived belief about their capabilities, one's own capability, as well as the capabilities of their climbing partners to handle adverse situations and challenges and achieve their goal. So now the question is how does self-efficacy relate to resiliency? Is it the same, just a different vocabulary, or is it perhaps a component of resiliency? Any thoughts?
I feel like it would be a key factor in resiliency, because if you're told you can't do something and you're telling yourself at the same time you can't do it, like your resiliency is going to be a lot lower than if either you're saying I can do it and other people are saying you can't, or people are saying you can and you're saying you can as well. Like, I think it's all a equation almost.
Yeah, I like that. And a couple of people type it in, it's a component. In the self-efficacy, I think we all, at least in this mountain climbing example, would say that this is a building thing. Like, you know, some of our PowerPoint slides, we build the slide, you know, every click of the mouse, one more picture builds onto it. So I think self-efficacy is a build type project. And because of what we've done in the past, gives us exposure and experience that we are, we have a belief that we can take on something in the future on that. And so certainly this relates very directly to resiliency. It is one component, a very important component of resiliency. Let's look at some other components. Next slide, please. So the book that you're going to see on this slide is one I'd recommend if you're interested in studying more about resiliency. And so they list 12 components, and they're going to be on the left hand of the slide. But as we read through these, look at these questions on the right hand side. How are current family, schools, and society doing in instilling these? And are our youth today receiving mixed messages, either at home, at school, or on social media? So keep that in mind as we're I'm assuming everyone attending this Zoom lecture has an interest in how to develop their own resiliency or help others develop resiliency. So let's look at some of these components. And different sources and different authors and researchers might slice it and dice it a little bit different. I like this list of 12, 6 on this slide and 6 on another. I like this because it fits well with my experience on dealing with people with trauma and resiliency. So first one, an attitude of optimism. So we talked about choice being important, but I think this attitude relates very much in there, and we've had a few comments on the attitude. A mindset of facing your fears. I think this is so critical, and this relates to self-efficacy. If you've faced fears in the past, you have this view of yourself and the world around you that you're going to face your fears in the future. If you have felt beaten down by your environment or others and you've never succeeded, I know of one young man who has schizophrenia who sometimes he gets into altercations, verbal or physical. And once he said to his father, he's about 25 now, he said to his father, you know, I've never been in a fight that I won. So I think his fears and his self-efficacy are kind of a big factor in that. What is your moral compass? Now, this next one is religious, spiritual, and faith. This is slightly different, although they might be interrelated, but your moral compass on what is right and wrong, what is your duty? In the military, the moral compass is something very big, as is the religious, spiritual, and faith. And studies have consistently shown that people who have a religious, spiritual, or faith orientation to the world around them, it helps them integrate new information, new experiences, and move forward. Social support, we get that, and we've already had some comments on that. Finding meaning and purpose in life. This goes right to the heart of Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning. But having that purpose of why are you going through this? Or this isn't what you want to go through, but you still have other goals and meaning in life. And this is a significant hurdle, a significant setback, but you still have this drive to achieve that purpose. Dr. Frankl mentioned some people in the concentration camp had a sense of, I want to write my last music piece. I guess there was a composer, and I still have some more music I need to write. Or someone meaning was, I don't know if any of my family have survived, and I need to survive in case my son is still alive, because he'll need my help. So having that meaning and purpose is very big. Next slide, please. So we'll see the other issues here. Physical fitness, again and again. You know, the military is very big on this because they've learned that physical fitness is a very important part of resiliency. Brain fit, now this is kind of interesting, a little bit different, but your ability to problem solve. Again, this is, many of these on the last slide in this slide are things that we can learn or do or improve upon through practice and training. And brain fit is one of them. There was an interesting study years ago. There's a group of nuns in Louisiana, and part of their community, what they do is as they join the community, they start to journal. So this spiritual reflection is a big part. But in the journaling, they talk about their regular daily life. And so the Alzheimer's researchers found out about this community, and they had a meeting with the sisters, and the sisters agreed to, when they passed away, that they would donate their bodies to the researchers. The researchers would remove their brains and view the brains under a microscope to look at Alzheimer plaques and tangles in the brain, and then compare it with their journaling to see if they could find any pattern. And what they found was that those people that had high context in their journal, wrote very detailed, typically independent of how many plaques or tangles, the hallmark of Alzheimer's, how degraded their brain was, they had higher social functioning. In fact, there was one sister who died at 80 some years of age, and her brain had been ravaged by Alzheimer's, but socially and interacting with her other sisters in the convent, she didn't exhibit any clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's. And what they learned was every 5 years she'd learned a new language or learned a new musical instrument or a new skill. And she was always pushing her brain to problem solve, to learn, to grow, that neuroplasticity. And as the Alzheimer was chewing up part of her brain, her neuroplasticity was still very active and she was growing in other parts of her brain. So this brain fit is very, very important. Cognitive and emotional agility. Now, agility usually isn't used with cognitive agility or emotional agility, but yet that's exactly what is needed in resiliency. The ability to adapt and improvise, the ability to integrate new information, the ability to operate outside someone's comfort zone. Becoming self-aware, and also the capacity to self-repair. And some of that are health promoting actions like making sure you're getting enough sleep, enough proper nutrition, things of that sort. Mindfulness plays right into this. And then notice this last one, the grit, tenacity, and determination. Now, oftentimes, this is what we consider the hallmark of resiliency, which it is, but this is only one of the 12. The other 11 components aren't all about grit. It's not all about determination, but these other things factor in. With these 12 components of resiliency, any comments, anything that jumps out at you or in your experience that you've seen to be something very important in developing resiliency or having resiliency for life?
I just have a couple comments. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. One of those key things that has been proven in research is the key support system, right? That one stable, caring adult in a child's life, which is one of those 12, that social support. But I've seen that highlighted consistently over the research. So in schools, we really focus on that aspect. And then I have one question about the religious piece. Some of you who have worked with people that subscribe to a certain religion or faith, and sometimes that presents a problem because they're kind of taught, or it's built into their culture, that as long as you do these things, everything will be fine and everything will work out. And so when that doesn't happen, it really damages their faith, which has been such an important part of their life. But then they can't really ascribe to that because they're like, well, it didn't all work out. It's not all okay. Have you run into that?
Yes, actually I have now. As I mentioned, I'm from New York, so I'm not from Utah, and this isn't my indigenous culture. But what I've seen in my work in the military and elsewhere, is there's something that some people have referred to, the soft crab phenomenon. Now, a crab has a hard shell, and as the crab grows, at a certain point, that shell has to crack, and then the crab wiggles out of it and goes on in life, and then grows bigger. And then over time, and particularly with the salt water and such, that soft shell hardens, and then it's in that new form. And then as it gets older and bigger, that shell cracks again, and then it goes forward. And so people of any type of faith, or the faith that helps them with a worldview and an orientation to life, oftentimes part of growing within one's faith is that you will be faced with certain dilemmas that exceed the size of your shell, so to speak, and your shell needs to crack, and you need to grow into that new space from that experience. And so if we help people reframe it, that, you know, my world has just cracked and all is lost, then that's a negative thing. But if we help them reframe it, that their worldview has cracked, they've been exposed to something that, or experienced something that wasn't part of the game plan, or at least how they viewed that game plan, well, then we need to help them that, okay, this is an opportunity to grow, and we need to incorporate and understand, not that we can always answer all the questions, but we need to incorporate and understand this experience and grow a little bit bigger. Now, the issue with the crab, seagulls somehow have this uncanny ability to spot soft-shelled crabs, and they love them. And so seagulls, it's a period of vulnerability for that crab until that shell hardens up again. And so seagulls can come down, and it's a delicacy for them. And it's also a delicacy in many seafood restaurants to serve soft-shelled crabs. And so same with people where their shell of faith and belief that has been previously protective and helpful now has to crack, and they need to grow and incorporate that. And so this is the issue of trauma, that we can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. These things happen, and much like a tree growing against a fence or a wire or a stationary object, that tree needs to grow around it and incorporate it and grow past it. We can't undo it and pretend that what has ever happened hasn't happened. And so this is where resiliency, even with the foundation of the faith and religious view and spirituality, resiliency is the capacity to grow through and with what has happened, rather than having that crack them and in essence destroy them or crush them. That cracking happens, and then they need to grow, like the example of the soft-shelled crab. Does that help answer your question at all?
Sorry, I was muted again. Yes, thank you. I love that. That's awesome. Thank you.
Good. Well, let me ask another question here on what do you think on the right side of the screen? How do families and schools instill these things, or how do they send mixed messages? Now, my understanding is many of you are in the school system and some of you are therapists or social workers and such. So from your experience, are you seeing that families are doing a good job instilling and fostering these components of resiliency, or are there mixed messages or maybe even negative messages that counteract someone's development of resiliency? Any thoughts? All right, so someone agreeing with the question, good. Some courageous person, give us an example or a comment here. I see both, Paul says.
So I have, like, for an example, I have students that I work with in a K through 3rd grades, and I am wondering, I try and stay really positive, but they think it's the end of the world because maybe they can't read a set of words or something. And so then that's where I'm struggling with, is I try and stay positive. I try and encourage them to do their best, but I'm looking for other ways to help teach them how to become more resilient in a positive way, I guess.
Yeah, I like that. And so here's one answer where I think our society, here we go, I think it depends on the age. Here's where society, I think, doesn't do well, because we've had about 15 or 20 years of go to your safe space and raise your hand if you're triggered. And in essence, it sends a message of you don't need to face hard things. You can withdraw from hard things. You get a pass. Now, there's a time and a place where we don't want to overstress someone. Soft-shelled crab, again, we don't want to crush them in their vulnerability. On the other hand, healthy life is helping that shell harden and helping them go forward. And we do the children, whether our own or students or community members, we do no one any harm by just putting some lipstick on the pig and saying, it's okay, you can underachieve and we still love you. We need to say, we love you and care for you for who you are, and we're going to help you step up and get better. And yes, you're struggling with reading. Now, I have 6 daughters and 3 of them have struggled with dyslexia. And so the answer wasn't, you get a pass. The answer was, how do we work together to overcome the dyslexia or to work with the dyslexia so that you can function and achieve the goals that you want to achieve. There is an axiom, and I was going to bring this up a little bit later, but I might as well now, that every time you rescue someone, you weaken them. Now this is rescuing, unless it's like a little picture here, true life-threatening situation. If someone's drowning, we need to rescue them. But to the extent, our children face a lot of challenging circumstances. And I remember we were living in Germany, so the kids were going to a military school, And my daughter came home, I think she was in the 8th grade or 9th grade, and now I'm a psychiatrist, and so they're used to psychiatry language around the dinner table. And my one daughter says, my German teacher is bipolar, and I'm going to fail the class because she's a mess. Now that might all be true. She might be bipolar, or it might be a 8th grade or 9th grade person just throwing around power words and making an excuse. And so my wife and I said, well, let's organize a way for you to work with your teacher to resolve these challenges. And at the last resort, we can get involved, but we always put a little hook in there. But I don't think you want mom and dad to get involved because it's not going to work out too good for you. So the best thing will be for you to resolve this with your teacher. We'll help you, we'll support you, but it's you resolving this with the teacher. And so, so that was not just saying, yeah, figure it out on your own, but giving them a way forward. I like to comment of empathy is still very important in there. We need to be, we don't know what people have experienced in life, so we need to be empathetic or empathic for that. But the key to resiliency is then giving them support and encouragement to step up rather than step away. Now, timing is a key issue on this, and having someone step up too soon or in an inappropriate environment is critical. Teaching kids that they can do hard things, very important, and that's going to come up in just a minute. Let's go to the next slide. So here we are, when we're born, is kind of the dark green line or the sage color line. We have a high degree of dependency and a very low degree of independency. And then whenever the kids launch, that might be age 18, 19, 20, when they launch, we want the reverse. When the kids launch, we want to have a high degree of independence and a low degree of dependence. Now, this is a simplified graph and it doesn't look exactly like this in real life, as you know. But with this, as their independence increases, and now this is an independence along the lines of self-efficacy and self-reliance independence, not as long as mom and dad are giving me money to spend, I'm independent, not that type. But as their independence and their increases and dependence decreases, then their resiliency increases. But in our culture right now, we see a high degree of independence, like mom and dad, you can't tell me what to do. And oh, by the way, can you give me a ride to the mall? Mom and dad, you can't tell me what to do, and my phone's my property, and you have no say in what I do with my phone or my computer. There's this inversion of that's not true independence. That's perhaps an appearance of independence in not stepping up and not recognizing their interdependence within the family. So, but the point on this graph is families should intentionally be moving towards raising their kids to independence and decreasing the dependence, and with that, the resiliency increasing. Next slide. So for a while, I worked in a prison in Ohio, and the warden came to me one day and said, Dr. Hubner, I want you to teach the inmates about self-esteem. They have very poor self-esteem. And so I did a whole lot of research on self-esteem, and I found that 99% of the programs on self-esteem really were not helpful at all. And so if we can go to the next slide, there's a couple of things there. So a lot of the programs on self-esteem, number one, they're classroom programs, and my view is you can't teach self-esteem in the classroom, nor can you teach resiliency in the classroom. But a lot of the programs were about, teaching people to put little positive phrases on their bathroom mirror and to make many self-affirming comments to themselves during the day, listening to their inner voice, things of that. Now, all of those actually play a good and healthy role, but they don't lead to self-esteem. Michael, can you pull up the next slide? There we go. So self-esteem really boils down to this. Self-esteem is a byproduct of doing hard things. And so if you want self-esteem, if you want your students to have self-esteem, if you want your patients to have self-esteem, encourage them to do hard things. And this starts by setting goals. Now, the initial hard things might be getting up on time, might be making your bed, might be helping your family do dishes at night, might be talking respectfully to other members of your family. And then stretching yourself into other goals. This one point here, learning to endure discomfort to achieve your goals is important. And I don't know if it's chopped off on the bottom there, but the last comment there is climb your Mount Everest. And the emphasis would be on yours. Now, I worked with a young man once. He was a 20-something-year-old college student. He had moderate autism and really struggled a lot with in social situations. He came home, this is when I was living in Ohio, came home to Ohio, home from summer break from school, and really felt very diminished, a very poor self-esteem. He got a job flipping burgers at a local burger place, and he absolutely hated that job. And we talked about this concept of doing hard things. And every week I met with him, and he wanted to quit his job. And we talked about at the beginning that staying with the job over the summer was going to be his Mount Everest. This was going to be his hard thing. And every week he said, I want to quit, and they don't respect me, and I don't like the way they talk behind my back. And certainly this was a very hard thing, particularly for a young 20-something, very self-aware of some of his social deficiencies, very aware of comments made behind his back. But to his credit, for those 3 months over the summer, he stayed with his burger flipping job. And by the end of the summer, he's getting ready to go back to college. He was a different man. Now, he still had issues, still had challenges, but his opinion of himself, his self-esteem was clearly evident because he had done hard things. Now, the key here, this hard thing for him wasn't putting him at risk. It wasn't in danger. So it was still a safe environment. It was just a very hard thing. And all of these things here, the goals and stretching and challenge, all took place over that summer for him. So self-esteem relates to self-efficacy, which relates to resiliency, and it's doing hard things. It's building on what those small goals are. For the one participant who mentioned a student who has a hard time reading, this is hard, and that social judgment and commentary is very hard. And we can still show that empathy and compassion, and then we help them start to set goals. They need to make a choice. They need to engage themselves, and we can help create the conditions or the environment that facilitates that, but we can't drag them in and make them participate. Next slide. So wrapping things up here, we got a little bit of a late start. So here's where we get to how do we train and teach resiliency. It comes down to a couple of things. One is this: we need to lead by example. You need to do the hard things in your life. You need to have self-efficacy. You need to live a life of resiliency. Now imagine a story, an example. Let's say you or someone has two kids still in car seat age, and you're driving down the road in the wintertime. It's just you in the driver's seat, two kids strapped in their car seats in the back. You hit some black ice, the car rolls 3 times and then lands on its wheels, right? So it lands upright. We'll make this a little bit of an easier story. No one's hurt seriously, everyone's banged around a little bit. What will those kids in the back seat do? Well, in the sake of time, I'll just get there, that they will look to the parent or the adult. This is an experience they've never had, and they will look to that adult or parent on what just happened, and I'm really nervous and scared. And if the parent starts screaming, oh, we're gonna die, we're gonna die, the kids will start screaming, we're gonna die, we're gonna die. Now, if the parent goes, wow, that was amazing, that was just like Witch Mountain at Disneyland, the kids will say, wow, that was just like Witch Mountain at Disneyland, let's do that again, or some version of that. And so the point is that our children and youth, whether they're your family members or those that you're teaching or doing therapy with, will look to you for an example of, I don't know how to process this, help me process this. In your example, and then your words, but primarily your example will be one of the most formative things in helping someone develop resiliency. But that means that you need to develop resiliency. Next slide. And on the question of can we get a copy of the PowerPoint, I don't know that answer. I hope so. Right, go back one. No, there we go. You're at the right one. Sorry, I was too quick on mine. So the other one is that this is not just about verbal teaching, but it's patterning, kind of your example, but showing what right looks like. And then you can play a very formative role. This is to develop resiliency is experiential learning. And so it's that debriefing or that verbal processing. We also need to let our youth have the experiences and the consequences. If we isolate and separate our youth from the consequences, again, we're disabling them and we're doing them no favors. But we can create this environment. We can also do the mentoring. You can see there the one version of what mentoring really is. So our example, create the environment, help them process it and mentor them through it, help them experience the consequences, good behavior, good consequences, etc., but also making sure that the consequences aren't life-threatening. Certainly running into traffic will teach them something, but the consequences outweigh the learning point. So we don't want that type of consequence. Next slide. So this next slide's let them figure it out for themselves and do not rescue. We already talked about that. I want to point out this book here, Sidney Poitier. Many of you know him as an actor. He grew up in the Caribbean, and he said one day he took on a challenge from his buddies, and there was a sugar cane processing factory, and there's this long gully that went into a pipe, a big, like 4-foot diameter pipe that emptied out into the ocean. And he and his 12-year-old, 14-year-old buddies, they always challenge each other who would be brave enough to go through that pipe all the way underground and come out into the ocean. And so one day he was alone, he did this. And as he went through this pipe, it got more narrow and more narrow. Now to make it a little more exciting, every day at 4 o'clock, the whistle would blow and the sugarcane processing plant would dump its wastewater and that would go out this pipe. And so he's going through this and he gets way down into this pipe and it gets more and more narrow and he's kind of wedged in. And then there's a steel grate that he can't go any further, but he's stuck and he can't really back up. And then he hears the whistle blow and he has about 10 minutes before they dump the wastewater. And he says in his book, he really thought he was going to die. He's all alone. Nobody knows where he's at. And he thought, this is it. I'm going to die here and no one's ever going to find my body. But he calmed himself down and he slowly unwedged himself and made it walking backwards through this pipe and got out, and then got out before the wastewater flushed through. In his book, he said this was one of the most formative experiences in his life, that he knew at that point he could do hard things. At that point, he had self-efficacy in his mind, and I think in reality, he had faced a true life and death situation, and this courage and self-efficacy and resiliency he carried through in life. 2 more slides. I know some of you need to sign off. Some final thoughts or just a review. Next slide, please. And this just rehashes and reviews what we've done. So we will all face trauma, and many of your students have already faced trauma. This is issue of growth versus stress. You need to know resiliency is a skill that can be developed. But looking on the bold face there, resiliency is learned by engaging and experiencing. It's not learned in the classroom or on a couch. Now, classroom and couch and dinner table can do a lot to help teach principles of resiliency, to help encourage, to help process something that's happened. But resiliency is learned step by step through experiencing and engaging. Last slide. One more slide here. These are the last takeaways. It's that quote from Elizabeth Lucas again. But also this, go back one more, sorry, that we need to exercise our choice and we need to do hard things, and resiliency is vital to a healthy life and self-actualization. That's the end of my presentation. The next slide is just a question slide. I know some of you need to leave, but I'll stay on and try and answer any questions, either verbal questions or typed in questions. Thank you very much for your participation in this. And we'll see if we can get this PowerPoint available to you.
All right, thank you. first off, thank you, Dr. Hubner, for presenting today. If you registered for the webinar, I will send you a link for the evaluation that needs filled out for the CE credits, if you're looking for the CE credits. If you aren't, then thanks for joining us. If you're just looking for information, when you get your link, there will be a code word in there. And our code word today is going to be Hubner 714. So if you did not register, email me and I will send you the link for the evaluation. And if you registered, you'll just need to put in the code word Hubner 714. So write that down. And if there's any questions, if you have any questions, please feel free to get a hold of us, email us. And thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate it.
I'm going to log off.
Lisa, see ya.
Mike,
Yeah, Jill.
hey, I just wanted to tell Mr. Hubner that was one of the best lectures I've attended on something that you can really utilize in the school system. I really appreciated it.
Thank you. Thank you. This is something that I think in the coming years, Dr. Hubner's got some ideas that he wants to implement into our program here at the hospital. And he's going to open that up to the schools. And I'm really excited. I think it's going to go right with our back to school program that we're doing with the kids as they return to school after the hospitalization. So I'm really excited about it. As I saw what we did last year and where he wants to take the program, I think it's going to be great.
Well, thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I work with domestic violence victims and children of child abuse, and this was such a great presentation. I just wanted to thank you very much. I've seen many like it over the years, and this was really great.
Thanks, Marcy. I'm excited what you guys are doing in the community down there. I think I would love to see some of the other areas that I visit get with you. I don't know if you visit with them through some of your guys' meetings, but I see you guys are just taking such leaps and bounds and trying to be so active and educating the community.
We're working hard. We've made a lot of changes in probably the last, 3-4 years, I suppose. Yeah, we've done a lot. I'm actually the co-chair for our PAC, and I worked at the health department for quite a while, but now I'm with domestic violence with the Utah State Coalition. But yeah, I live here and I care about our community, and yeah, we're doing good things. Thanks for.
You are. Thank you. Thank you.
Care. Thanks so much.
Yeah.